This
nutrient
conference
sources.
will now be recorded.
My apologies, Ed. Continue.
Yeah, no worries. You know, the focus of the estuary program has been on controlling nutrient sources for the benefit of creating clear waters in the bay. In turn, that would allow enough light to penetrate to the bay bottom to support additional seagrass recovery. So we've made tremendous progress over the past 30 years on that. As you all know, we've been attaining our recovery goal of about 38,000 acres, which is now bumped up to 40,000 acres in 2020. Since the 2014 period. So we've been above that recovery goal for the last 3 assessment periods of the water management district. But if you haven't heard, we got some fairly recent news from the district that indicates that we're having issues, particularly in the upper bay segment. So the latest assessment in 2020 showed a significant decline in seagrass resources, about 5,000 to 6,000 acres loss of seagrass in the bay over those 2018 levels that were last mapped. So that is definitely a concern for us in terms of managing the system for the benefit of fish and wildlife, including manatee. But in particular, as I mentioned, it gives us pause and a warning sign, not trying to mimic some of the conditions that we're seeing elsewhere, namely like the Indian River Lagoon, where they've had some significant water quality issues that led to significant seagrass die-offs, and now they're seeing cascading effects in their lagoons ecology, particularly with potentially some mass mortality events related to manatee. So we definitely don't want to mimic those conditions in Tampa Bay. So everybody has been on alert with these latest results, and we knew, and we're kind of expecting these results because of the routine annual water quality assessments that we perform each year. And for the past 5-6 years, Old Tampa Bay has been sticking out as a sore thumb in terms of poor water quality conditions. And it's been primarily related to summertime bloom of an algal species called pyridinium. That particular algal species is capitalizing probably on the nutrient conditions in that bay segment, as well as some of the poor circulation patterns that are exhibited in Old Tampa Bay. And that has led to the non-attainment of water quality standards as it relates to supporting the continued recovery of seagrass. So we've been reporting on this for quite some time, trying to work with another group that we facilitate called the Nitrogen Management Consortium to understand what's driving those pyridinium blooms to occur each summer and what we could do about it in the future. And what we do know is that the bloom is likely responding to nutrient conditions, but it also is capitalizing on those poor circulation patterns in Old Tampa Bay, namely the poor circulation caused by some of the bridges and causeways that circumvent that bay segment. So we know there's significant gyres where residence time on the water is fairly significant, upwards of 3+ months that water can potentially sit and cook in this area. That in combination with early rainy season discharges lead to this particular algal species to bloom each summer. So this picture in the middle is from 2017, showing the rust-colored discoloration of the water. Not only does that cause issues, just aesthetic issues in terms of algal blooms in the water, but it does also produce a toxin that can accumulate in shellfish and also potentially cause issues for fish consumption of a particular species. So this has been an ongoing research and priority for the program. And again, I think that the fixes are multiple in fashion in terms of Old Tampa Bay. It's not just the nutrient issues, but it's also addressing some of the freshwater inputs and the circulation impediments that are present in that bay segment. And we continue to work on that, and that's sort of has been our focus up until the 2021 period. Just to kind of show you where those losses in seagrasses have occurred. this is a slide directly from Dr. Chris Anastasio, who runs the Water Management District's aerial mapping program. The picture on the left is the distribution of seagrasses in 2018, or the map on the left. The map in the middle is the conditions in 2020. And those darker green areas are signatures for attached algae, namely the algae Caulerpa. So we saw this big transition from rooted seagrasses to attached algae species of Caulerpa, particularly in the Old Tampa Bay. And it was almost a one-for-one replacement between those stable seagrass beds and this patchy algae species that tends to come and go, and it does not need as good as water quality as other seagrass species in the bay to take hold and outcompete those seagrass resources for light. So we saw this big turnover from the 2018 and 2019, our 2018 and 2020 assessment period, and we're trying to understand what that means for the bay's ecology and what sort of the next progression might be for that bay segment. Similar sort of things happened, like in Indian River Lagoon. They saw some macroalgae and algae blooms that were precipitated by poor water quality events, and then they subsequently had additional seagrass die-offs. So we're, like I said from the beginning, we're trying not to repeat sort of that lesson learned from other systems in our home Tampa Bay, our own backyard. So again, we continue to try to understand what were the drivers of this, and if we had any significant nutrient loading as well as poor circulation patterns over that 2018-2020 period that we could better manage in the future. And that's really, this busy slide is what this busy slide is trying to summarize. So we continue to look at more innovative ways to manage that Old Tampa Bay system. So we've been working with FWRI to look at increasing shellfish restoration opportunities in Old Tampa Bay to potentially knock down that pyridinium bloom in particular niche areas where we know the blooms initiate each year. We're also looking at continued ways to, like I said, improve circulation. So there was one Causeway Breach that was built by the Department of Transportation back in 2019 period. If you drove the Courtney Campbell Causeway during that time period, you probably recognize some of the construction on the east side of the bridge, the Tampa side, sort of close to Ben T. Davis Beach. That low bridge that they built was directly trying to attempt to improve circulation. So we know that we want to probably pursue additional projects like that on the other bridges and causeways, and there might be opportunities to do that in the future, particularly on the west side of the Courtney Campbell and the Howard Franklin Bridge. As I mentioned from the beginning, our mantra as the estuary program is trying to reduce coastal nutrient pollution from all sources. So, we know, particularly in Old Tampa Bay, that there's issues with both stormwater sources being the main contribution of nutrient pollution going into that bay segment. But we also know atmospheric deposition, just the deposition of nutrients from both dry and wet deposition is also a potential driver of some of the poor water quality conditions that we're seeing in that bay segment. And there's a variety of initiatives looking at further improvements on wastewater treatment plant upgrades or other reclaimed or reuse projects that could serve as a benefit for reducing nutrient pollution to that bay segment. So we continue to try to focus effort and attention on those things. And lastly, just to mention, there are these community awareness campaigns that we've been part of, that we've been advocating for and promoting each year. You probably have heard of the Bee Floridine campaign, as well as the Pooches for the Planet campaigns to try to reduce our watershed footprint in terms of nutrient pollution from our community, the greater than 3.1 million that now live in the watershed. So those initiatives continue, and other ones are starting to get ramped up that would have hopefully a benefit on further reducing nutrient loads and getting the community involved in actions that could be supportive of improving water quality as well as improving water quality for the benefit of seagrasses in the future, namely trying to get your private laterals repaired, inspected, or replaced if there's known issues. And then the new initiative in the future that Joe's going to be working on is an boater education campaign focused on boat propeller scarring that we know are issues in certain parts of the bay and can impact seagrass resources negatively. So all in all, that was our focus up until about 2021. As I mentioned, the Piney Point discharge event really has compromised some of our attention as of late in terms of focusing on those core issues that we know are problematic for our bay, particularly in the upper stretches in Old Tampa Bay and in certain extent in Hillsborough Bay. But the Piney Point event is definitely something that we're nervous about as a potential tipping point, like I was mentioning in terms of the Indian River Lagoon. We don't know if this might push the bay further across that brink in terms of continued losses of seagrasses. We're monitoring water quality conditions as well as seagrass and macroalgae conditions throughout the lower part of the bay, where we know and have estimated the trajectory of where the plume of that original discharge might be impacting the shorelines. And there's also concern of further closure procedures of that facility, because there's still a significant wastewater burden on site that they're going to potentially need to treat and or discharge the surface water or groundwater in the future to fully choke and close out that site. So any ongoing activities related to the closure, we want to continue to monitor and try to understand if they're having negative impacts for the bay's ecology. And so far, we have shown that there's been some significant algal bloom cycles that have occurred since the initial discharge events. And the latest, as y'all are probably aware, and what we were talking about at the beginning, is the intensifying red tide bloom that we've been observing since about late April through mid-June. So just want to mention that we know that this red tide was probably not initiated by the Piney Point discharge, because we know there was an active bloom further south all the way down to Naples, going as far back as I believe last fall. We know that bloom crept up to our coast from the winter and spring into early summer. So as mentioned, it was first starting to appear in late April. We started getting hits in the lower part of the bay, but since that time, we've seen this intensification co-located in areas where we know the Piney Point discharge is potentially having an influence in terms of the nutrient loads that went in the bay. So there's been some significant reports, I think, this week of more intense fish kills, just because the onshore winds are probably blowing some of the fish along some of the Pinellas County beaches. But there's also been reports of fish kills within the bay proper all the way up to the Alafire River on just what was mentioned, MacDill Air Force Base as well. So there's bloom both in the bay and along the coastal beaches. And again, the further implications on not only the fish, but other resources like manatees is still probably yet to be seen. We definitely don't want to repeat what happened in 2018 in terms of the intensity of that 2018 bloom, but we know with the latest conditions and the Piney Point event, and we're setting ourselves up in a not so good footing going into the more intense summer rainy season, where we know we'll get additional nutrient loads going into the bay, which could further exacerbate what has already happened in terms of the Piney Point discharge and any shading effects on seagrass resources and continued impacts from these algal blooms on, as I mentioned, the fish and wildlife resources throughout the lower bay and the coastal beaches. So we'll leave it at that, and just continue to emphasize the lessons learned from other systems in the state. It only took about 1 to 2 years in the Indian River Lagoon to see significant turnover and a condition that went towards dystrophic conditions in terms of a complete and significant loss of seagrass resources that has completely changed how that system now responds to nutrient load. So they have really significant algal bloom issues, a variety of different HAB species now occurring there because of that loss of stable seagrass habitats that serve as a balance to the total ecology of the system. And they're suffering from a variety of fish kills and the latest suspected manatee mass mortality events just to potential starvation because of the loss of seagrasses and the lack of nutritional value that of the remaining algal species that are taking over where the seagrasses once proliferated in that system. So again, we have some lessons learned that we don't want to repeat for the Tampa Bay region, and it takes a lot of vigilance to address the core issues that we face, and there are many. They deal with Piney Point, deal with these ongoing issues that I mentioned in Old Tampa Bay, and just got to make sure that we're all rowing up, in the same direction at this point, and take a renewed effort on what got us that initial recovery in Tampa Bay, is namely working and addressing all sources of nutrients that are flowing into our coastal water bodies. And I think we continue to, light that torch, raise that torch for those efforts, we will once again be successful and hopefully turn around some of the poor conditions we're now seeing. I'll stop there. I don't know if anybody had any questions. That was probably a real quick overview of what we're seeing in terms of conditions throughout Tampa Bay, but I'll stop there.
All right, thank you, Ed. Does anybody have any questions for Ed quickly before we move on to another presentation? All right, well, I appreciate it as always, Ed. Andy, are you ready to present? I can make you the presenter if you'd like.
Yeah, I think so.
Sure. I'm gonna send that to the Andy Garrett one, not just Andy, because I see the two. I'll try this out. Let me know if that works for you.
I think it does.
Yep.
Are you guys seeing my present? Okay.
Yep.
Okay, so I'm gonna really totally piggyback on what Ed just went through, because I was maybe a little confused when the request came up for managed mortality events. Certainly this is the Tampa Bay area is the focus, but I think it's really important to understand, also have you guys see what's going on the other coast. So I will cover some Tampa Bay numbers here, but I'll kind of get into a little bit of what we're seeing or what we saw this winter with the mortality event. So in early December, we noticed the numbers of carcasses from our east central or Atlantic coast started going up. You guys can see the chart here, where the red line is the baseline, and there, the second week of December, you can see there's a little bit of a peak there. It went down and then started peaking again. But that was kind of our first indication there's something going on with the number of carcasses coming in. And then in January, we had another peak, or actually two more peaks. For us, we have what we call a UME, unusual mortality event from marine mammals, and so we had trigger numbers in those first and third weeks of January. So early in the investigation, some of our challenges, just the unprecedented workload. We are still working, and up until just recently, have been working on COVID guidelines, which makes things really challenging when you're talking about marine mammal response, especially for rescues, where we need a team of 9-10 people to go and catch an animal. Subsample of fresh carcasses was prioritized for necropsy. The first evidence of primary starvation determined in carcasses in February 9th. We started seeing some of the starvation stuff going on, and there was an unusual large proportion of carcasses that were adults. On the right of this slide, you can see the Manatee Rescue. So we had a fair amount of rescues as well along the Atlantic coast. A lot of them were congregated around the warm water sites manatees use in the wintertime on the Atlantic coast. So again, unusual mortality event. We submitted for that. It's an official designation from the federal government. We submitted for that on February 17th. The working group recommended to declare UME based on several different criteria. There's a marked increase in magnitude or marked change in nature of morbidity, mortality, or stranding when compared with prior records, and then also affected animals exhibit similar and unusual pathological findings, behavior patterns, clinical signs, or general physical conditions. So now, so obviously we had more animals coming in dead, and they were all showing the same kind of signs. So those are the two big ones that had this declared as a UME. And that again, not trying to get too much into semantics of it, but manatees are federally overseen by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, where dolphins and sea lions and seals are seen by National Marine Fisheries Service. But a lot of this program, the working group is under the National Marine Fisheries Service, so they work together as federal agencies for that declaration on March 22nd. So here's what we were finding along the Atlantic coast. We were seeing severe emaciation, so body conditions, indices up to 40% underweight, widespread serous atrophy of muscle and fat. So the animals weren't eating, and they were starting to use up their fat stores. Atrophy of liver, heart, and hemidiaphragm is remarkable. So again, you know, these are the starvation signs we're seeing on the carcasses when we were doing necropsy, gross necropsy. Blood data of the rescue manatee suggested end-stage starvation. The effects of prolonged starvation on the body were not always visible despite resumption of foraging. So you can see in the photos that on the bottom, those are at least the carcass on the table. You can see how flattened they are, how thin they are. And then the photo on the left is the body fat. The fat stores were depleted, and that serous, that watery is the animal breaking down its fat to use to stay alive. And then top right was a calf. I'll get into that in just a second. So the cause of UME, again, what I was just describing, which is the Indian River Lagoon has had numerous repeated long-lasting phytoplankton blooms that block the light needed by seagrass. That started back in 2011, but it's just been constantly a problem. They've lost a lot of their seagrass coverage. What we think had happened was, most of the areas around the power plant had lost the seagrass, but Mosquito Lagoon was holding on pretty strong for a long time. And then I think once that went last year, that was the last area where animals could really get to, like in a day's swim from the power plant. And once that was gone, the animals had nowhere to go to feed. They decided to stay warm at the power plant, or did some bouts trying to find a place to eat, and there was nothing to eat, so they were starving. Almost no alternative vegetation or macroalgae in the Indian River. Also, they were changing their diet back in 2013 and eating macroalgae to stay alive, but we weren't seeing a lot of macroalgae either. So early in the event, winter, it's possible certain cases also had some confounding factors of manatee cold stress cascade. So, we had issues with malnutrition. If they're not eating, they're not digesting vegetation, they're not producing internal body heat. So then there's the compounding factor of that going on as well. So here's a map of the carcasses and the rescues. So preliminary number 660 carcasses. Again, this is all causes of death, and it shows you the different month breakdown. But you can see where the carcasses are concentrated. A lot of the where it looks pretty red, those are areas of warm water sites. We were finding animals dead. So the current UME investigation, future concerns, review of that UME health data, environmental data. So we're still processing carcass data, and still the carcasses really dropped off. We're still getting a handful in, but we're not seeing quite the findings where the animals are obviously not having to stay at power plants, and they're spreading out. We're reviewing the histopathology and clinical pathology review of the rehab cases, the animals that we did rescue that were brought in. We'll continue to monitor through necropsy and rescue. There's additional testing to better understand the health status and pathophysiology of starvation in manatees. So we have a sample archive. And then we just have concern for long-lasting health effects on reproduction, metabolism, current population, next generation. Obviously, we're anticipating this is going to be an issue next winter as well. I mean, we had hundreds of animals die this winter, and it's not like the seagrass bounced right back. So, if these animals come back into winter malnourished or didn't rebound very well from the event previous winter, they might be set up for even a worse winter coming up. We did do some rescues. Just a reminder, we live animal responses was and still is the highest priority for us to get the live animals that are showing distress. We work with other rehab partners, rescue rehab partners, to respond to distressed manatees and provide care. So these rescues along that Atlantic coast, included some watercraft cases, orphan calves, cold stress, emaciation, and then we had some unique cases too that were a result of the UME. We had animals that were swimming on their sides. They had these weird lung hematomas that were causing them to list and swim in a weird way. A lot of these cases were observed at the warm water winter aggregation sites like the power plant in Brevard County, Port Everglades plant, and the FPL cooling lake. So if you see that animal in the top right-hand corner, that's an animal that's listing on its side. Usually we see that when an animal's been struck by a boat and they have a collapsed lung. They'll show that kind of presentation, but for these are animals that didn't have any kind of watercraft damage to them. Again, animals swimming on their side, kind of a weird posture, weird behavior. We did get some that were spotted when people are doing aerial surveys. You guys can spot the sideways swimming animal there. Again, mentioned the emaciated animals that obviously were starving to death, terrible body condition. Another thing we started seeing is increase in calf rescues, and for us, a calf by itself is considered a lone manatee rescue under 175 centimeters. So since the start of the UME on December 1st, 2020 through June 8th, we've had 13 rescued on the Atlantic coast. For the entire state, we've had 17. So you can see there the 5-year averages. So 2021 is already it's 16 for the year. You can see the other ones are 5 years. So we're way ahead on the calf. And what we think might be going on here is that if you can imagine, just understanding biology, a manatee mom who's lactating is using up a lot of energy to feed her calf. And if she's not getting energy to supply herself, she continues to feed the calf that energy. And so we saw a fair amount of lactating females dead during this event. And what we think happened is that these calves were given the energy from their moms, and so they stayed alive. But then when the mom died, they became orphaned. And we had some interesting cases. Here's one down in the cooling lakes. We thought it was going to be a mom calf pair. The mom, had a little bit of watercraft injury and was thin. So we had a plan to go catch her, and then the morning of, we found her with 3 calves, and so we're kind of scratching our heads like, what's going on here? These must be calves from dead moms that they're, if she's lactating, they're hanging around her. Well, we ended up catching them and found out that the adult that was there was actually a male, and these were just 3 orphan animals that were probably just latching on to any adult in the area. So in this rescue case, we ended up with 3 orphans and an injured adult male. So those were taken to Miami Aquarium and are in the rehab currently. And I think from previous meetings, you guys know that these little orphans, they are resource sinks. We do grow them over the course of a couple of years, and then we monitor them once they're released. And they're very expensive cases, but it's just it's a sad result, I think, of this UME. So ongoing research and monitoring, we're going to continue to salvage carcasses and do necropsies. We have photo ID that will continue on too. So we take photos of manatees and their scars and match those up. And so we'll hopefully get some survival reproductive rates as the time goes on. We'll continue to monitor the temperature in the winter. There are different transects being done, seagrass, transects and aerial surveys being done on manatees, getting distribution. We're tagging some of the animals that came in once they've been rehabilitated. Some of these animals that had the issues like the sideways swimming, we're releasing those animals, and we're monitoring to see where they go for the summer, and then when they come back and what they do. And we're planning other types of research too. We're spending all summer trying to gear up for what we might be faced with coming next winter. Ed covered a lot of this stuff, so I don't think I need to cover it in great detail, but again, he mentioned the seagrass diet, what that looked like, and over the course of all those blooms, Indian River is basically turned into a desert of just sand. And of course, as the seagrass dies off, the turbidity continues to get worse because the seagrass keeps the sand and the sediment from kind of getting washed around. So it's turned into a really bad situation over there. We did get some macroalgae growing, which manatees can feed on, but in some places it didn't grow. So again, they're working on habitat restorations and trying to get the water quality better, looking at restoration projects for the summer. A lot of the similar type stuff, looking at ways to improve water quality and trying to fix the habitat. But until they can get that water quality better, I mean, we've talked about replanting seagrass and things like that, but until they get that water quality better, I just don't think anything it's going to really fix the problem. So continue to monitor. There's habitat workshops, working on legislative funding for both habitat restoration and warm water habitats, and we're actually applying for money to get some funds for some manatee research projects as well. So kind of moving back over to our coast, you know, again, Ed covered a lot of this too, just the ongoing red tide has got us concerned. Thankfully, we've not seen any kind of mass mortality of manatees in Tampa Bay or any of the other areas. We've had a couple cases here and there, but nothing too crazy. We did have a case yesterday. This was a manatee called in that was laying next to a seawall, fairly buoyant and unresponsive. You know, we didn't know what was going on, if it was a watercraft case from the weekend or what, but I had my suspicions it might be a red tide case. So again, just had our biologists respond and, you know, just gently touch the animal. Usually we get some kind of reaction, and the fact that we didn't get any kind of reaction, you know, indicated we think this animal had a red tide toxin in it. So we ended up catching it yesterday and took it to SeaWorld for rehabilitation, and that's where it is now. So for Tampa Bay Mortalities, here's the breakdown. See if that's, is this blocking your, I can't tell if you guys are getting blocked by this or not, but so anyway, 2020 Tampa Bay mortalities. So statewide, we had 637 last year. So you can see, you know, basically the mid 20s for each county. And then so far this year, Hillsborough is at 22, Manatee is at 6, and Pinellas is at 15. Statewide, we're at 782. So again, 637 last year, and statewide we're already at 782 halfway through the year. So hopefully that trend does not continue, or we're going to be over 1,000 animals before the end of the year or more statewide. And then for rescues, again, I get this. I don't know if you guys can see this or not, but
I think we can see it. I can at least see it on my screen.
Okay. So last year we had 4 rescues in Hillsborough. We had 2 in Manatee and 9 in Pinellas. And this is all online. If you guys have access to myfwc.com, you can go and look at the different stats. We have different tables that are released each week. But statewide in 2020, we had 120 rescues. I'd say annually we're somewhere around 100 rescues a year. So again, that's a little bit higher than what our normal is. And then here we are in 2021, our statewide is at 92 already. So locally, I think we're probably about on average. You know, Hillsborough is at 6, Manatee 4, Pinellas with 4 as well. Any questions?
All right. Thank you, Andy. Any questions for Andy?
I get one, Andy. This is Ed. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I got you, Ed. Yep.
Are you guys tracking any of the current populations in Indian River in terms of seeing if they are doing better in terms of feeding on any seagrasses that are, you know, starting to capitalize on the growing season? Or
well, we've had a couple surveys. Unfortunately, with COVID and everything else, I mean, our budget was put on a freeze, so it was kind of challenging to get resources. But we've had a couple scheduled, and I don't think we're seeing anything significant as far as I've seen through the correspondence with our biologist. I mean, I'm assuming most animals have kind of spread out and gotten away from Indian River and those areas to areas that they can actually feed. But you know, I didn't mention, you know, part of the problem with this it's affecting the entire Atlantic coast. The seagrass population down in Southeast Florida is not much better. It's actually been, you know, under fire with issues too. So, you know, some of the animals tried to escape and head down there and probably didn't find much better situations. So, but you know, we're not seeing the mortality in Southeast Florida has really come down to 0. I don't think we had any last week at all, which is great. And it's been fairly low the past month or two in Central East Coast too. So. Okay. But yeah, but I'm assuming the animals are finding vegetation now. You know, they're going up into creeks and things, and I guess eating that macroalgae and chlorpa and things like that. But yep.
All right. Well, thank you, Andy. I always appreciate the context you're able to provide. We're going to move on to Shannon. Shannon, are you ready for your presentation?
Yep.
Shannon. Okay. I'm gonna make your presentation. Just let me know when you get that notification. Should be up now.
Is that working?
Yes, it is.
Okay, so I can't see it. Is there a way I can see it as well?
It's a good question. Ed, do you have advice for that issue? Have we run into that before on
In the sidebar, you should be able to see the audience view. There should be a tab. It'll kind of show what's being viewed by everyone else in the audience.
I don't see it, but I'll just work with it. And if I end up on the wrong screen, you guys can work with me. But I'm not sure how I can advance it.
I can
It's not
also
in-
display. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Ed.
I was saying it's not in presentation mode yet, Shannon.
I have no. Let's see. What if I do this? Oh, I see what I need to do. Does that work?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So hello, I'm Shannon Gowans, and I'm going to be presenting on behalf of myself and my colleague Amy Sweda for the work that we've been doing over the last few years on manatees and microplastics. So I wanted to give you a bit of a background of our project. So we've been running a microplastics monitoring program for the past couple of years, and what we've been doing with that is we look at environmental microplastic samples using both surface bucket samples to get very small microplastics. We run net tows to look at floating microplastics at the surface, and we've also been looking at sediment samples to see about the microplastics that have settled down on the sea floor. We also wanted to look at the possibility of the incorporation of microplastics into the ecosystems through grazers, and we've chosen to look at the extreme ends of the grazing scale by looking at both copepods and at manatees. And I put up the website we have for our project if any of you want to get some more information on our general project. But as we looked at manatees as the largest grazers in Tampa Bay, we did know from work that Andy and others at the Marine Mammal Pathobiology Lab have been involved with is that we know manatees do ingest plastic. This work was previously published, but was looking at, as a necropsy is done, they work their way all the way through the gastrointestinal tract, feeling through to see if they can find larger pieces of plastic. And what they found from 1993 to 2012 is about 10% of the carcasses they were looking at, and that's Florida-wide, had microplastics in the GI tract. But they also noticed that the percentage of microplastics had been increasing over time. So this gave us a good opportunity for collaboration. So we collaborated with the Marine Mammal Pathobiology Lab, and what we were looking for is fresh manatee samples that had an intact GI tract, because we wanted to make sure that any of the microplastics or the plastics that we were finding were inside the manatees when they died, as opposed to potentially coming from the environment. And so we were looking at animals from the Tampa Bay watershed, and we collected samples from December 2017 until March 2020 for this work. So we're basically looking at two main questions. First off, were we seeing evidence of them consuming microplastics and getting a sense of what kinds of quantities? And also, are manatees serving as aggregators of these microplastics as they graze on large volumes of seagrass? So what we did is, working with the Path Lab, we collected about 500 grams of GI tract samples from 5 different locations along the gut. So starting at the stomach with the most unprocessed food, moving through the cecum, we collected the duodenum, and then the proximal colon and the distal colon. So working from close to the head all the way out till where it's basically just about to become feces. Nobody has looked at microplastics in these kinds of large volume herbivore grazers. And one of the challenges as we started designing an approach to look at them is the large volume of seagrass that, of course, these manatees consume, and the fact that they are eating this very heavily cellulose-based material, which is actually very hard to break down and digest. So other approaches had used chemical decomposition to try to get at breaking down the cellulose, leaving just the plastic behind. But when we looked at anything that would take to break down that very large volume of cellulose, would also break down the plastic itself that we were really looking for. So what we opted for instead is basically visual inspection. So this is looking at a sample from a portion of a manatee's gut, and basically our students would work through and carefully look through, looking for pieces of microplastic that had been missed during that standard palpitation going through the entire GI tract. So we had a very wonderful group of students that were willing to spend hours tediously going through these samples looking for plastic pieces. We were able to find quite a few plastic pieces. So this is looking at some of the small plastic pieces that we have. And just to give you a reference, this scale bar is about 1 millimeter. So we were finding pieces, but the smallest pieces we were able to find were using this approach were about 1 millimeter. So a little bit smaller than this piece, but most of what we were finding was on the larger than 1 millimeter size. We did also find some larger pieces that we also were able to collect. And again, these were missed during the standard approach that the Path Lab does. They're still pretty small and would be easily missed amongst the very large volume of a material that the manatees have. As far as what types of plastics we saw, the most common type of plastic we saw was monofilament line. We did see fragments of balloons, fragments of plastic bags, but and here you can see some what's probably polypropylene line, but most of it were particles that we couldn't really identify what they had come from. So as we look at this, do manatees ingest microplastic? Over that 3-year study, we had 26 manatee carcasses that we examined. 5 of them, about 20%, had macroplastics. So the Path Lab, during their regular necropsies, found larger pieces of plastic. During our examination of the subsample pieces that we looked at, contents that we looked at, 19 or 73% of the samples had microplastics. And when we put that all together, we had 21 of the 26 individuals contained some aspect of plastics within their GI tract, either micro or macro, or quite a few had both. So what we clearly found is both micro and macro plastic can be, detection can be found throughout the entire GI tract. It's found from the stomach right down to, just as it's about to become feces, and that our microplastic detection, because we were subsampling only a very small portion of the tract, we likely undersampled. So I would anticipate that if you were able to go through the entire volume of the gut content, and manatees have extremely large guts. If you get a very large, very full manatee, you could picture filling 2 large garbage tins full of gut content. So to sift through it is incredibly challenging. But what I would say is that 73% with microplastics, 81% having some plastics is an underestimate, and probably the vast majority of manatees are having microplastics and macroplastics in their, some form of plastics in their GI tract. So as we look at our manatees concentrating microplastics in their GI tract, the graph that you're looking off on the side has the number of plastic particles per gram of sample examined. In those 5 locations, the dark bars represent per wet weight examined. So this is like we would see actually within the manatee. And then we also did the same analysis based on dry weight. So after we removed the plastics, we dried out the sample because that removes out the water, and we wanted to sort of get a better sense of what we were seeing as we moved through. So what you can see is there's clearly microplastics found throughout the GI tract. there wasn't any clear pattern of concentration within the 500-gram samples that we took. However, manatees are actually taking that seagrass and concentrating the food as it's going throughout their GI tract. So the amount that they take in and the amount that they excrete out are not the same. So they've removed the water, they've removed some of the nutrients, and they've concentrated that seagrass down into a very concentrated ground up form. So they're doing that as part of their natural digestion process. So if we take the stomach, which is the part of the manatee that has the least processed contents, and if we look at the wet weight, we see an average of 0.68 particles per kilo of wet weight. As a back of the envelope calculation, some of the estimates I've seen say manatees consume somewhere between 45 and 65 kilos per day. So mid-range, looking at a 50-kilo stomach, probably if we scale that up, has somewhere around 40 plastic particles. So it indicates these animals are probably having quite a few plastic particles in their stomach, in their GI tract at any time. What we're also seeing, because we don't see a huge concentration in one location and then very low amounts later on in the GI tract, that these small pieces are likely passing through the GI tract. Very large pieces can sometimes get stuck in the GI tract and cause manatees additional problems, but these are likely just passing through the GI tract as the animals are eating and moving that large quantity of digestive material through. So if we look at our conclusions and where to take this further, it's clear that Tampa Bay contains microplastics, and these microplastics are being consumed by grazers. We also see ingestion of environmental microplastics by copepods. Most of the manatees have plastics in their GI tract, and that manatees are likely passing this plastic through their GI tract. And one of the things that we're concerned about is that are they compacting this very large volume of seagrass with its contained microplastics into a small quantity of feces that has relatively high concentrations of microplastics. So for some of the future work, some of those plastic particles we were finding are big enough that we could use techniques such as FTIR or Raman spectroscopy to give us the chemical signature of the plastic, which would give us a better indication of where those plastics have come from. We want to look more at how microplastics may be being concentrated within the GI tract by having a better assessment of what the volume that we're looking at as we go through the GI tract. Some work that is beyond the scope of our project, but something that we did not look at all, is are manatees absorbing any contaminants from these microplastics. So we didn't look at if these plastics are causing any kind of health impact. We only were looking to see were they actually present. Future work could look at seeing are there either contaminants that are leaching out of the plastic itself that could be absorbed by manatees, or is there contaminants that are sorbing onto the plastics, because microplastics actually sorb contaminants such as DDT from the environment. And then if they're in the GI tract of these manatees, are the manatees then getting further exposure to these contaminants? So that's something else that would be good to look into. And something else that we want to look into the future is the role of seagrasses within the ecosystem as sinks for microplastics. So we know well that seagrasses allow sediments to accumulate when the currents are slowed down by the presence of the seagrasses. This may allow microplastics to also aggregate in these locations. There's been some work in other places that have shown that microplastics can adhere to the algal growth on the blades of seagrasses. So we may see seagrass beds actually accumulating microplastics, further putting manatees and other organisms in those seagrass beds at risk for microplastic contamination. And then I want to thank a number of people for the work that they did on this project. This work was funded by Tampa Bay Environmental Restoration Fund, and we couldn't have done this without the Marine Mammal Pathobiology Lab providing the carcasses, especially the work from Martine DeWitt. And we rely heavily on those Eckerd College students to work through those samples, and especially two students, Shane Feld and Sabrina Soros, who were really critical in developing these methods. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Great, thank you, Shannon. Any questions for Shannon? All right. Well, again, Shannon, I really appreciate you providing all of that information. As same to all of the presenters, I think these meetings are greatly benefited by providing all of the context that y'all just provided. No, it was a little rushed, and we are reaching the end of the meeting, but I do want to invite anyone who can stay to stick around for a quick sort of roundtable discussion. Especially love to hear from some of the new members, any thoughts you might have based on the information you just heard, or how we can look back at some of the projects that have been done in the past through the MAC, or some new initiatives that we might be able to create. So I'd love to hear from anybody if people have thoughts. Also, these thoughts would serve as content for future agendas for the next meeting that we put together.
Joe, I got to jump off here in a second, but I think it'd be useful to maybe have another update meeting before the end of the year to kind of see if there's been any change conditions in our bay segment, and what we in our bay, and what we need to do perhaps to ramp up efforts for further protecting resources going into 2022. So just to be good just to bring people back together and give another update towards the tail end of this year.
Yeah, I think that'd be great. I was going to suggest something closer to the middle or closer to the end of fall. If people feel comfortable planning for something then, I'd be happy to coordinate that.
Hey, Joe, this is Erica. Just a quick question for any of the scientists on the call. So I did spend the weekend over in the Indian River Lagoon. I'm just curious, is there any comparison to sea turtle mortality rates over there with the manatee deaths that have occurred? Is anybody?
I'm not 100% on the sea turtles. I mean, I think a lot of the manatee mortalities, we're seeing is either we had a 2013 event too over there, and that we think that was because they switched their diet to the macroalgae and had some gut issues from that. The most recent was obviously the starvation. I don't know about the turtles and how they've been doing. I mean, I'm assuming almost all species that rely on the seagrass beds have had major issues because there's just nothing over there.
Yeah, it was just a curiosity question. So, okay, thanks.
All right, any last questions or ideas, comments? All right, well, I appreciate everybody for taking the time out. Like I said, I'd like to get another meeting, hopefully potentially one with more conversation. Maybe we'll have another presentation if needed, but I'd definitely like to drill into some ideas that people might have, and I understand that we might need to have a bit of a spitballing session to get there. But you can look out for some information about a meeting to be coordinated closer to the end of the fall, closer to the end of the year. And of course, I welcome anybody, if you have any ideas in the meantime about potential meeting topics, to please reach out to me at joe@tbap.org. And again, thank you to all the presenters and everybody who took the time out to come to the meeting today.
All right, thank you.
No
Thank
problem.
you.
Thanks.
Hey, Joe.
Yes.
Hey, is there a thought about doing so the MAC originally, we did a lot of public education. I mean, 100 years ago, before some of the housing developments went in over in the Apollo Beach area too. we helped provide some like public education information sessions to homeowners and the people who are going to be boating over there. And, you know, it's been a really long time since the MAC has done any public education kind of thing. And I'm just wondering with, you know, new boaters and the way that people feel about the bay, and I'm just curious about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so that's kind of the direction that I've been leaning in, and it's been a result of getting a lot of calls from just people living in the public, expressing interest in getting some signs provided to their community, and just, you know, more educational materials that they can hand out around their community. And, you know, I'm a pretty big fan of using them as champions of our information, you know, in the same way the CAC, kind of like the TBP ambassadors. So I'm really interested in figuring out how to put more tools into the hands of those, you know, that audience, those people. So, you know, I think that'd be a good topic of conversation. I know, just kind of looking through some of the past work that the MAC has done, like the manatee friendly neighborhoods.
Yeah.
Be interested in knowing like how successful you thought, someone who's been working with the MAC for so long, how successful you thought those were, and if there's a potential to sort of bring those back in some new fashion.
Yeah, I just that area I was giving a lot of thought to, only because, you know, those were going to be new homeowners, new impacted area, new, you know, and so I think we had a real opportunity there to reach out to them. And, you know, I'm sure that you're, you know, the way the housing is going here, and the new influx of people, and I think it's time for some education. I'm starting to notice more, even in my own office at the college, right, where somebody will call the college, right, we're looking for an expert to tell us what to do because we have fill in the blank. And, you know, a few weeks ago, mine was, I'm at Walsingham Park and there's bees and I'm trying to walk my dog and I need someone to eradicate the bees at the park. Like, I moved down from New Jersey and there's not beehives in the park. And like, you know, it went on and on and on, because like bees were in the tree, but that's where they live. And so I'm finding that with all wildlife, and it's not just the manatees, but I do get some, you know, manatee questions. And of course I usually try and point them to some of the resources. However, yeah, I think some new.
I definitely agree with that, and, you know, I'd love to, you know, investigate how we can better inform if we do create new materials, you know, how we can apply some of that. You know, the TBP likes to have things backed by social science if possible. If we can apply some of that to create some messaging, some content, but even if not, just making the stuff that we already do have, that we have quite a bit of, you know, just boater guides and manatee infographics, things that we have in storage units, making that available. And that's kind of what I've been thinking about, how to use social media to let people know that, like, we have these kits we can put together for you if you'd like to make them available.
I think back to the homeowner association is a really good idea, because it's all the topics, right? Like, I have some new neighbors here in Euclid, St. Paul, where I live, and trying to encourage them to pick up after their pets. And I'm like, there is a whole campaign about pet waste, and it's not the same as where you lived in Kentucky, because I have a neighbor who's from Kentucky. We just put it back in the ground in a cave, and I'm like, you can't do that here. It affects. And so I feel like some of the general knowledge, needs to be redistributed.
I'd definitely be interested in figuring out how to improve upon the manatee component of that. I think there's, you know, I'd like to put together a kit that is pretty comprehensive of, you know, like I said, we just at TBP, we've got so much content in boxes, so many physical things that I'd like to get out there, and there's just not enough tabling events in the world. So I think, you know, putting something like that together, and in unison making something that's, you know, potentially refreshed with manatee content, if that's needed. If it's not needed, if we've already got, you know, what we want to be saying, then no need to reinvent the wheel or create more stuff. But
yeah, well, I think the connection to Piney Point too is really important, and people needed to know why it's important that that's a big disaster. And, you know, the reason that people moved here is for the way of life and all the beautiful plant flora and fauna. So if we can capitalize on the charismatic megafauna angle, it'd be great to do that.
Yeah, it's something I just came across when I was reading some, you know, manatee related articles in the recent weeks, was people mistaking, or people thinking that, you know, so they're connecting the fact that manatees are starving in other parts of the state. So does, you know, does that mean I need to like feed them? Is there a way that I can feed manatees? And of course, feeding the manatees is illegal. So I have no data to back this up, and I don't know how much of an issue this is, but I'm wondering if that's another potential misconception or flaw in people's thinking of like, how can they help manatees? Well, maybe I feed them because they're starving. You
Yeah,
know,
the feeding and the watering thing is a really big issue.
yeah,
Do you know who Amber Howell is? She used to be on the manatee stuff, and she was here in St. Pete. Now she's on the other coast. She's the officer over there.
yeah,
Yeah,
the name's very familiar, especially when I was first
yeah.
starting.
They're in that whole like Miami to Key West area where she works quite often. The other thing is the people on social media feeding and watering manatees, off their docks and stuff so they can attract their relatives and neighbors to come out and watch, and using the TikTok and that sort of stuff to.
Right.
So yeah, I think you're probably onto something there with making sure just the basics, like don't feed them.
Yeah, I
Don't
mean,
water
and
for them.
it takes some nuance because everyone loves those videos. Charismatic megafauna. They love seeing
Right.
that people interact like that. But I think it takes a little bit of nuance and subtlety, especially on social media, to communicate the right message without completely shooting down the things that people have done unknowingly. But yeah, I think there's some potential there for outreach materials to address that.
Cool. Yeah, well, I'm excited to see you guys pick this back up again. So I'm happy to help and work. And it was really cool to restart it with some science in there because there's a lot of
Yeah,
new information that I didn't know. So totally, yeah, I
yeah.
love manatees, but they're not my wheelhouse. So
Yeah, I
cool.
feel very much the same, and that's kind of why I'm really appreciative to have you on here, someone who's got that knowledge of how the group has functioned in the past and their successes, and then of course bringing in people like Andy and Shannon, always great.
Yeah, super good. Okay, cool. Well, have a good afternoon. Thanks for putting this back together, and I'll look forward to the next session and then
Yeah,
hearing what about education stuff.
cool, sounds good, and I'll be seeing you at the CAC.
Yep. All right.
All right.
Bye.